Welcome to the very first episode of Capital Crosstalk, where we'll be interviewing experts, activists, and more on the latest news. In this inaugural episode, we'll be taking a look at international policies under the Biden administration, and we'll explore the future of the Statehood for DC movement, which has gained a lot of attention after the shift to Democratic power in the White House and Senate. To start us off, however, we're going global with Professor Gregg Brazinsky. Gregg Brazinsky is the director of the Asian Studies program and professor of international affairs at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. He's also the author of Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War, and Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of a Democracy. He has dedicated much of his academic career to U.S.-Asian relations, and today he's here to talk about the prospects for America's relations in East Asia under the Biden administration. Professor Brazinsky, thank you for joining us tonight. So now moving into the Biden administration, we obviously now have Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Blinken had obviously followed up on Pompeo's statements, claiming that the oppression of the Uyghurs in China does constitute genocide, and has said that some initial measures to try and fight back against that oppression will be passing sanctions from the U.S. on exports from the Xinjiang province in China. Do you think that this policy will realistically have any effect with the Chinese treatment of Uyghurs, and how do you expect it'll affect our diplomatic talks with China moving forward?
I actually think that sanctions rarely are an incredibly effective tool when it comes to human rights issues or changing actual policies. I think especially in the case of China, and I wouldn't say that there's zero cases in diplomatic history where sanctions have worked or have had an impact, but I think that generally they're not the most effective tool. I think in the case of Xinjiang, the sanctions mostly are on, as you said, goods produced in Xinjiang, and the argument behind them is that these goods are produced with slave labor. I do think where the sanctions will have an effect, and I think their main impact might be that they call greater attention to the problems of the Uyghurs and to the issues that the people of Xinjiang face. That is where they can actually have an impact. But I don't think that in the immediate future, China is going to say, well, there's a few new sanctions, therefore let's just completely alter our policy. I think China views what it's doing in Xinjiang as very critical to the survival of the People's Republic of China, and very critical to assuring that the CCP maintains its dominance over Chinese politics. So if you put it to the CCP, what's more important to you? Possibly losing control over Xinjiang or a few sanctions on top of what the Trump administration has already put on China. I think they're probably not going to adjust their policies towards Xinjiang very much. And another point which I think is very important when you talk about the United States economy and where it's going, and China's economy and where it's going, China is doing much better economically than the United States is right now. And that's another reason that I think our capacity to damage China with sanctions is limited.
Secretary Blinken, just like his stance on China, has taken a seemingly more aggressive approach in some aspects to North Korea. And he's offered up a number of different solutions to try and normalize, to a certain degree, relations with the DPRK. One such suggestion was to provide humanitarian aid for the ongoing famine in North Korea, which is largely induced by the United States' own sanctions against the DPRK. So do you expect such an effort to kind of feed the North Korean people and provide humanitarian aid to create any success diplomatically for the United States?
Well, I would say a few things. First, I don't think that the famine in North Korea and the dire economic circumstances that the country faces are solely attributable to US sanctions. I think sanctions play a role, but so do North Korea's policies. They have a lot of opportunities for trade with China and trade with other countries. I think they could be doing better economically with, if they carried out real economic reforms. So I would say that. But in terms of humanitarian aid, that's something that I support, and I think I think it won't hurt and can only help. The humanitarian aid at its best can help to reduce mistrust between the United States and North Korea. And that's what we really want to do. Will the Biden administration take a tougher stance on North Korea? That's something that still remains to be seen. I've heard Blinken saying, well, we're going to carry out a comprehensive review of our North Korea policy, and we may consider more sanctions, but I hope it doesn't mean that they're going to, automatically do that. I hope they'll look realistically at what you can accomplish through sanctions and what you might accomplish by trying to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table. One thing which I hear the people in the Biden administration saying that I completely don't agree with is when they say, well, we need to get China to help us on North Korea. China will never give us what we want on North Korea. A lot of people think that, China and North Korea really don't like each other. I don't believe that that's true. I think the relationship between the two is very complicated, but to say that they hate each other or don't like each other is really a gross misunderstanding. And to think that China is just going to sort of solve North Korea for us is also very unlikely. It's unlikely not only because of the current friction between the United States and China, but also because there's a very deep and long-standing cultural and historical bond between China and North Korea. China really regards the Korean War and the defense of North Korea during the war as one of the critical moments in the consolidation of the Chinese Communist state. And it's a critical part of the mythology of the PRC. And so to think that they're just going to abandon North Korea or pressure North Korea to the point where it might collapse if it doesn't negotiate, I think that's wrongheaded and it's not going to happen.
All right. I want to thank you once again for joining us tonight on this inaugural episode of Capital Crosstalk. Thanks again for joining us and answering all of our questions. You've been a very informative interviewee, and I hope to have you back on.
Thank you for having me. I've appreciated the opportunity to be on your first show here.
Great. Thanks again. Now let's focus on an issue a little closer to home here at GW, DC statehood. Here to talk with us about the future and possible developments of the Statehood for DC movement is Matthew Oberstaedt, the leader of the George Washington University chapter for Students for DC Statehood, an organization committed to educating students to advocate for statehood for the citizens of Washington, DC. Matt, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I know we're talking about DC statehood, but just so for some clarification for our audiences at home who might not be familiar with this movement, just talk a little bit about DC statehood, why it's such an important issue, and why it matters so much for the citizens of DC.
According to the Constitution, you can only have representation in Congress if you're a state. It says that members of the House of Representatives are allocated to states based on population. It says that each state gets 2 members of the Senate. And so if you're not living in a state, then constitutionally, there's no way you can have representation. So citizens of the nation's capital, despite paying taxes, fighting in wars, having to abide by all federal rules and regulations, don't have any representation in the Congress that governs their society. But it's actually even worse than that, because the Constitution also says that the nation's capital has to be based in a federal district over which Congress has complete legislative control. So unlike in most states where you have a state government that sets local policy. In DC, Congress is the final legislative authority. And so even though we have an elected mayor and council, Congress can overrule any decision they decide to make. The federal government controls a lot of local law enforcement operations like the DC National Guard. And so basically, Washington, D.C. residents are the American citizens who are the most directly controlled by the federal government with some of the least representation in it.
Yeah.
So what Washington, D.C. statehood would actually do is take the residential parts of the District of Columbia and turn those into the 51st state. And it would leave like the downtown core government buildings as the federal district that is constitutionally required.
And obviously, you kind of brought up about the legislative aspect where potential representatives from DC could have a really big impact. Obviously, that's part of the reason why this issue has become so politicized. A lot of people point to the fact that the district is currently, looking at 2016 voter data, 76% Democratic, and it's only increased since then. So a lot of people point to that fact as a reason it faces such fierce Republican opposition. So what do you make of that Republican opposition? Why do you think it may be justified or unjustified? And how do you think Democrats overcome that?
I think that Republican opposition, or really the opposition to it on political grounds, doesn't make a lot of sense from an ethical perspective. When we're talking about something as basic as who should get to vote, who should have representation, it really shouldn't matter, who you're choosing to vote for. The goal is to have everybody have a voice at the table. So I wouldn't argue that Wyoming shouldn't be a state because it votes Republican. The same way I don't think anybody should be arguing that DC shouldn't be a state because it would probably vote Democratic. And I also think Republicans or people who assume that DC would always be a Democratic city are simplifying things a bit too much. When we were debating statehood for Hawaii and Alaska about half a century ago, everybody at the time thought it would be a great compromise because Hawaii would be a Republican state and Alaska would be a super Democratic state. And lo and behold, within about 10 years of statehood, both of them politically realigned. And I think Alaska has only ever voted for about one Democratic presidential candidate, and Hawaii has only voted Republican maybe once or twice. So just because the city favors Democrats in most recent elections doesn't mean they always will. And even if they will, that doesn't mean they shouldn't have representation.
And then obviously right now, the name Muriel Bowser has been popping up in the news as a result of the protests that were happening in the summer for Black Lives Matter, as you were talking about after the murder of George Floyd, and then the Capitol riots that we just saw a few weeks ago. What does the transition from a DC City Council to a state gubernatorial structure look like? Would somebody like Muriel Bowser be promoted from mayor to governor in the interim? Do they create a new structure and elect a new body? What does that transition look like for DC?
So according to the current statehood bill, I believe what it says is that whenever statehood takes effect, whoever is the mayor at that time would become the governor. Whoever is on the city council at that time would become members of the legislature. And I don't know, since I don't know when exactly DC statehood is going to pass, I don't know who the mayor and city councilors will be at the moment. But Washington, DC actually drafted a proposed state constitution to go along with our pitch for statehood, which I believe is available online. And it's the government structure is fairly similar to the current city council one. Although I think, for example, they're expanding the number of seats on the city council. They would sort of change how some of them are elected. So there would be changes to the government structure, but it would be fairly similar to the current one.
Thank you once again for joining us tonight, everybody. That was Matt Oberstaedt, leader of the George Washington University chapter of Students for DC Statehood. It was a very informative interview, and I just want to thank you once again for joining us tonight to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you.
And that wraps up today's inaugural episode of Capital Crosstalk, where we will be interviewing experts, activists, and more on the latest news. Please go follow our social medias and tune in next time. Thank you.